Okay, for the records, I'm going to ask you to please state your name, birth date, the war you served in, your branch of service, and the highest rank you achieved.
Okay, name is Brian McAleer. Birth date is November 9, 1947. I was in the U.S. Navy. It was actually Naval Reserve, which is a 2-year commitment. Highest rank I achieved was Petty Officer Third Class, which is called an E4 or Enlisted 4 in the service. I don't know, is there any other?
The war you served in?
Oh, Vietnam War.
All right. And this interview is taking place on November 15th, 2011 in Durango, Colorado. I, Eli Kopp-DeVol, will be performing the interview, and with me are Sally Burchett and Yunki Kim. This interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. All right. So just starting off with some basic questions. Where and when were you born?
I was born in Manhattan, New York City, November 9, 1947, as I said earlier. Mm.
Yes. And so what were you doing before you entered the military?
Well, I was actually working for New York Central Railroad. I had graduated from high school. I had put in 2 years of college. And I decided that I really didn't want to go to college anymore at that particular point in time. I was kind of not sure of what I wanted to do. So I got a job at the railroad.
All right. And was this, were you pursuing a career, or was it just kind of an odd job that you were?
I was trying to figure things out. I didn't really have any career path at that point.
Okay. So, do you have any brothers or sisters?
2 sisters, younger than me.
All right. And where were you living at the time that you entered the military?
I was living at that particular point in time with my parents.
Okay. In your
in the Bronx, New York City.
Okay. And what did your parents do?
My father, incidentally, was a World War II veteran in North Africa, but he was a truck driver for well over 40 years in New York. And then when he retired, he really didn't retire because he got a job with the BSEIU, Building Service Employees International Union. So that was what he did. My mother was a housewife.
All right.
And a very good one, I might add. And a great mother, also I'll add.
Very important. So you say your father was in the military. Did you have any other friends or family in the military? And like, if so, what conflicts were
I
they
had
in?
several friends in the military, you know, and most of them were Vietnam related. That was it, you know, outside my father.
Yeah. So then how did your father's experience in war and in the service affect your attitude toward the military?
I actually admired what he did, but I didn't really have much of I didn't give it much thought, to be honest with you. I knew that I didn't like regimentation. I didn't like being ordered around. I wasn't a Boy Scout. I had no interest in uniforms. So I would not have been in the military had it not been for the draft. The draft is what forced me in. Even though I enlisted because the pressure of the draft was bearing down on me.
It's interesting. So what did you think about the war in Vietnam before you entered then?
I had some serious doubts about it, but I didn't have a whole lot of information. I was a bit too young and not well schooled enough to have a definite opinion of it. All I knew is that there were kids in my neighborhood who either were coming back, you know, with issues, or not coming back, you know, coming back in a box.
Yeah.
And both options didn't seem very positive to me. So, however, one of the reasons why I joined is precisely because of that, because I had 3 good friends of mine who got killed in Vietnam, from the Bronx neighborhood I came from. So, you know, I'm at that point 19 years old. I don't have a lot of options, and I certainly can't just walk out on their honor. You know, their parents, their families I knew very well, I grieved with them. When it came my time, I felt somewhat of an obligation to them, more so than anything else, to go, to honor their service. And that's what kind of got me involved. And going to Canada, I don't know much about outside of my neighborhood at that point. Even though I lived in New York City, it's not like I'm some kind of cosmopolitan person at 19 years old. I don't know that much about downtown New York. So never mind going to Canada, that's just out of the question. So, as a result, I went, to honor them, really. That'd be my main reason.
So, how did your family feel about you entering for?
Well, my father, as being a veteran, it was almost like a rite of passage, as far as, he was in World War II, and it's just kind of what young men did at that point in time. So he didn't really have a lot to say about it. My mother was rather upset about the fact that, I was going over to Vietnam, I could get killed, and I was her only son.
As expected.
And, she was upset about it.
And did you feel, how did you feel about going to the war as far as your safety was concerned?
I had no idea what to expect. I knew that it was a random situation over there, that clear lines of battle weren't drawn, that the war wasn't measured by territorial conquest, it was measured by body counts. So I just said to myself, well, I want to just be on the right side of that body count and, not get caught up in much else, and then just try to survive. Do what I have to do to the best of my ability, but otherwise try to survive. That's kind of the way I looked at it, and I didn't know what to expect, other than that.
So, that's very interesting. Going into training, I suspect you went through the basic trainings. Can you describe a kind of average day of training that you went through?
Well, I was a naval reservist, so our basic training was held in Waukegan, Illinois, at the Great Lakes Naval Training Center. I believe that's what it's still called, and it's still a place where prospective, people go to get into the Navy. It was near Christmas time when I went, so it was bone-chilling cold. I remember that very well. I remember getting woken up very early in the morning. What happened is I knew that they were going to shave my head before, so what happened is I kind of didn't want, for some reason I said, I'm not going to give them the satisfaction of shaving my head. I'll shave my head before I get there. It was just my kind of way of handling it. In other words, you don't have to shave my head. I'm already shaved. I'm good to go. I'm ready to go. And it was very cold. I remember there wasn't really called a drill instructor in the Navy. He was a chief petty officer.
Okay.
But he filled the role of a drill instructor, like a Marine drill instructor.
Okay.
And, he would, at some ungodly hour, we were woken up, and it was still dark out. I remember that. And, there was a lot of, falling out on the grinder, they called it. You have to get out of your bed, have the bed made, have everything done, lickety-split, down, out of the building, into the dark, onto what's called a grinder, which is really just a marching area. Then we would go through various drills, and then we learned small arms fire. On one day we were put inside a gas, a simulated gas chamber with gas masks to learn how to operate those, or tear gas it was. It wasn't gas, other kinds of gas, but tear gas. Those are the things that I remember pretty clearly. I remember going to the shooting range with an M16 and being taught how to use it. Lousy food. And I also remember very clearly this, it was Christmas, and at Christmas time, on Christmas Eve I was there. So we had Christmas Day off. So I decided to go to Chicago. At that point I was 18 years old. And so I said, let me go to Chicago. I didn't know anybody, And I got to Chicago. Christmas Eve, and I couldn't even get a drink because I was too young. I'm not too young to be in the military, not too young to get killed, but I'm too young to have a drink. And I remember thinking, something wrong about this. There's something really wrong about it. And I remember being very depressed on Christmas Eve, that particular Christmas Eve. So that's what I remember.
So what would you say the hardest part of your training was?
Well, it just so happened that it was very cold.
Yeah.
So the weather at that point in time made it harder than it probably would have been in the spring or fall, particularly. I don't know what it's like there in the summer. It's probably pretty hot and humid. So that would really be the hardest part of it. Otherwise, it wasn't that hard. I've always prided myself on staying fairly physically fit. So although we did a lot of jogging and all of those kinds of things, and push-ups and various physical activities, I didn't have any problem with that. That was, there were some of the other people did, but I didn't smoke cigarettes particularly, so I was a little bit better off aerobically, maybe. Yeah.
And so you said it was really cold. Do you feel like this prepared you better for being shipped off, or
not in the least? I went to a tropical country,
Yeah.
So it was irrelevant. As far as the weather goes, they should have had us operating in some kind of a very, very hot steam bath kind of requirement. They should have taken us down to Panama, for that matter, and put us in the jungle. That would have been a much more appropriate training.
Yeah. Did you feel like any part of your training was valuable?
Well, it's valuable in that you learned how to use firearms responsibly and effectively and efficiently, and how to load and unload, how to put clips in M16s, how to use the safety, how to use a .45 automatic, the kind of recoil weapons have, and how you have to, or firearms, I should say. They're weapons they're firearms until you kill people. Then I call them weapons. That's my opinion. Prior to that, they're called firearms. But anyway, those were very vital and very important things to learn. So it was certainly instructive and important for me to know those things going where I was going. I didn't know I was going to Vietnam at that point in time.
Okay.
That was to come later.
Okay.
Yeah.
So moving more into we were actually in the service, and where you went. Where were you stationed in Vietnam?
I was stationed in two places, just about 6 months in each. When I arrived in Da Nang, and I was in what was called Naval Support Activity Da Nang, which was a big operation.
Okay.
So there were subunits of that. Most of the sailors who were there were based in a place called Camp Tenshaw. Tiensha. That's where our barracks was, and from that barracks you would go out to various locales in the Naval Support Activity area. So I worked in a variety of different locales there for 6 months. Then I got transferred after 6 months. Basically, at that point, Nixon, in my view, was deceiving the American public by saying, we're bringing troops home, and here's the number of troops that are leaving Da Nang. Well, I was one of them in that number. And it's true, I was leaving Da Nang, but I wasn't coming home. I went down to the Mekong Delta. Okay. When I was in Da Nang, I was in a place called 4 Corps. Then I went down to the Mekong Delta, that was called I Corps, or 1 Corps, Roman numeral 1. The reason? Cambodian invasion. So, that was happening around February 1970. I can't recall exactly. It's been a while, but that's how that shook out. And then when I got down there, I was in a place called Binh Tui, just outside. The biggest town was the bustling metropolis of Canto, Cantho. But outside of Canto, there was a little ville where there was a naval base that housed. Basically, it housed two major fighting units: HAL 3, Light Helicopter Attack Squadron 3, and SEAL Team 3. You've probably heard of the SEAL. This was SEAL Team 3. Okay. I'm pretty sure I recall that. accurately. So I was one of the people providing support to both of those units in a place called Bin Tui, B-I-N-H, capital T-H-U-Y, Bin Tui.
So you said it was, of course, really humid and hot there. What were like your first impressions of the area? How did you feel about being in Vietnam? Just the area itself.
Well, interesting, tropical, hot, humid, scary, because, as I said, lines weren't drawn in that war.
Mm-hmm.
So you were subject to attack anywhere at any time, and probably when you least expected it. So as a result, there was a pretty high level of anxiety that you come into a situation like that in, and just about anybody will start at that point. But you can't keep that level of anxiety for a year. So you find coping mechanisms, and you find ways to relax or get more comfortable with the situation, but also still be wary and alert and cognizant of what's going on around you and who's around you and who's in the room and where you sit in the room. And some of the things are done by police in this country on a regular basis. When you walk into a room, you never sit with your back to the door. You always sit so you can see who's coming in the door, into the room. Those little things, you learn when you're over there. But initially, you don't know much, so you're very anxious. Yeah.
So you said like coping mechanisms to deal with anxiety. What were some of yours?
Well, I read a lot. Let's see. I relied on the support of my buddies. Got a lot of care packages, as we called them, from home that I look forward to getting. Honestly, there were there was drinking that went on. There was smoking reefer that went on. Unlike Bill Clinton, I smoked and I did inhale from time to time, but it wasn't a big part of my coping mechanisms. I used other coping mechanisms. I didn't really do that very much because of the cardiovascular fact that you're inhaling smoke. I didn't like that. So I wasn't big on that, although there were some guys over there doing opium.
Wow.
Getting into serious addictions, and it was quite quite an interesting thing, and in fact we had some of the more naive guys who came into our unit. I remember one particular guy from the South, and I actually remember where he was from, a place called McAleer, South Carolina. This poor guy came in and he got introduced to drugs. I don't know if he ever got out of there alive, and he's probably listed as, he may even be on the wall in Vietnam. I can't even remember his name. But it may not be because of enemy fire. It may be because he overdosed on opium. I don't know. I mean, I hope he survived.
Yeah.
But he had an addictive personality, obviously, and he got turned on to smoking dope, and he had no discipline, no control, and and then also when we were involved in certain operations, the last thing in the world you wanted to do was be high. So that wasn't a big coping mechanism. That's a whole long story that I know a little bit about, but not a lot about.
Yeah. So you mentioned like your buddies, and it's really often emphasized how much camaraderie comes out of war. You hear that a lot in like war stories and books. Did you develop any of these really close relationships?
Well, the interesting thing about Vietnam, as opposed to other wars, is that Vietnam was the war where you went over alone, and you came back alone for the most part. So, if you're familiar with existentialism, or if you know anything about philosophically about, people like Jean-Paul Sartre, maybe you don't learn that in high school yet, but you will in college. You basically are an individual. You come into the world by yourself. You make contacts with people, but really you're ultimately alone in a philosophical sense, because you're going to be born in and of yourself, and you're going to die in and of yourself at some point in time, hopefully a long time. However, you're by yourself, you know, more than likely. I mean, you could be in some kind of situation where a whole group of people die, but it's an individual experience for each single individual. And Vietnam was really the highlight of that, because unlike World War II, unlike the Korean War, unlike the wars that are occurring right now, there's units. They go over, they train together, they develop what I would call esprit de corps, or camaraderie. They all go over together, they do their deployment or their tour together, they all come back together. So you get very close to people when that happens. Now, that's not to say that I didn't get close to people when I was there, because we relied on each other. But I may be close to a guy that he's going to get out of Vietnam 6 months before I do. So just based upon that kind of thing on an emotional level, you have to be a little bit standoffish. I mean, if I get too close to this guy and rely on him too exclusively, emotionally particularly, and then he's going to be gone 6 months, well, what am I left with? I'm still there. So you kind of parceled out. The esprit de corps wasn't hard and fast. It was basically an individual decision that you had to make about choosing who your friends were, who's going to back you up when there's trouble, and so forth. So you became close with people over there, but it was a whole different kind of closeness, because there was a certain wariness about time and how that was going to affect the relationships.
So there was a lot more to the friendships than just emotion. It was
Yeah.
So, what was it like being out of the United States during the wartime? Like, what emotions were you experiencing over there?
Well, I missed the United States. You know, I would read about things like Woodstock, and I would say, gee, that looks like fun. You know, what am I doing here? I want to be there. But that wasn't to be, you know, so I kind of just, you know, sometimes you just blow it off. You know, you didn't really spend a lot of time dwelling on it, because it was kind of depressing. You wanted to know what was going on in the States, and there was a newspaper called the Stars and Stripes, and still probably exists, you know, military. You know, but it's, as with any newspaper, you know, they're not totally objective. They kind of slant towards whatever philosophical bent they have. So I wouldn't totally rely on that. I'd get papers from home sometimes from people, and tapes, and, you know, what's the new music, what's happening, is there a new Beatle album at the time, you know, the Stones, did they put out a new album, you know, things that I was interested in, as any kid would be at that age, you know, rock and roll and things like that, culturally. You just try to find it out as best you could. And that was the way I did it.
So, what would you say your most memorable experience from wartime is?
My most memorable experience. The best, I guess the most memorable, because it's the most positive, would be when we went at Christmas time, a group, you know, my unit that I was with, the guys that I was with, on a voluntary basis. But just about all of us volunteered, you know, when we were asked. The voluntary assignment was go to this Vietnamese orphanage and give out Christmas presents to the little kids whose parents were dead. The parents were probably killed as a result of some kind of hostile involvement. I really didn't care whether those parents were, whether they were, you know, Republic of Vietnam supporters, or whether they were Viet Cong, to tell you the truth, because I just felt badly for the kids. And to see the kids light up when you could give them a present, you know, they had no parents. Their parents were gone. Their family was gone. So to see them light up on Christmas was probably the highlight of my time in Vietnam. I found that to be the best thing that I did. Not only there, but maybe ever. One of my top, you know, things that I've ever been able to accomplish. So.
That's really cool. Talking about combat, what sort of emotions did you experience in combat?
Okay, well, with combat, you have to understand this. Every combat infantryman, they were the ones that bore the brunt of the war, the combat infantrymen. And I don't know what the ratios are, you know, now, and I'm not even clear if I can give you the ratios back then, but for every combat infantryman, there's probably 6 people supporting that infantryman in the field.
Okay.
And by that I mean, that infantryman has to be fed, he has to be clothed. He needs medicines from time to time. He needs morale from time to time. He needs mail.
Mm-hmm.
He needs ammunition. All variety of not only creature comforts but war-related things, and all that support comes from the 6 or so people. If you ratioed it out, that's how it would turn out. About 6, maybe even more, to that one person. Well, I was one of the 6.
Okay.
In that I'm not out in the jungle with an M16.
Okay.
I was a storekeeper in the Navy, which is a supply job. But within that, there's a variety of different jobs you could do. So I did all of them. I worked in warehouses. I worked with forklifts. I was loading trucks with forklifts. When I went down to Bintui, I was on guard duty. I was on CH-47s, which are still used, the Chinook helicopter. If you've noticed in the news, you'll see them from time to time, the big double prop copters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a CH-47.
Okay.
And, we'd drop supplies, we'd pick up supplies. We dealt with cargo for the most part, and that was my job on that helicopter. You had pilot, co-pilot, and 2 door gunners. So that was another facet of what I did, and I didn't do that all the time. Many times I'd be back working on inventories and getting manifest ready. But we also, on occasion, sadly, would have to take back deceased, in body bags on those helicopters, and that's when you handled that with extreme care and caution and respect. And frankly, what I tried to do whenever I had to do that, which wasn't often, thank God, but it did happen, the only way I could emotionally handle it is I had to think that this is a very fragile piece of luggage. I knew there was an individual in there, as a human being who's no longer alive. So I'm going to handle it like a fragile, like a piece of fine china, and that's how we would, do that. Because if I stopped and thought about it, I think I would have just started crying. I could do now.
So you say you sustained service-related injuries. Would you care to talk more in depth about these?
The only thing I'll say about that is, probably because more of the chopper experience, the helicopter experiences, we flew through a lot of mists and things like that. And then we were also handling materials that were toxic, specifically Agent Orange. That my disability, I'm on a 40% service-connected disability, and it's more than likely Agent Orange connected. I won't go into much more detail on it. It's kind of not pleasant. So.
Okay.
But anyway, Agent Orange would probably be the reason.
Okay.
No, I did not get wounded. I do not have a Purple Heart. We got shot at on occasion, but it was very rare. Fortunately for me. Yeah.
So I understand that death, it's a very sensitive topic. Are you comfortable discussing this openly?
Death? Sure.
So how did your feelings towards death evolve over the time that you were in service?
Well, I just knew that when we were all over there, I'd say, geez, we're awfully young, and some of us aren't going to make it. And it's kind of like lotto, who's going to be the unlucky one, whose number comes up. And I remember thinking, this is not the way it's supposed to be. I mean, we're 20 years old. I should be have my whole life ahead of me, looking forward and with great optimism. Right now, I'm ducking for cover, not just physically, but, literally, but figuratively. So it just didn't seem appropriate. It's like death applies to old people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and particularly when you're that age, you know, you think you're never going to die. You know, you kids have your whole life ahead of you, and you should think that way. You want to think that way, you know, but the clock ticks,
Mm-hmm.
and that's just reality, you know. But that's the way it should be. It shouldn't be you're going to be taken off before your time is due. And if you go to that Vietnam Wall in Washington, D.C.,
Yeah.
you'll have, I don't know the number now, something like 57,000 people who got taken off before their time was due. That's why that memorial is so important.
Yeah. Did death start to come easier to you, or did it remain equally as difficult throughout the war?
Yeah, it's never easy.
Mm-hmm.
Never easy. And fortunately, like I said, I wasn't in combat, and I didn't have
Yes.
people getting shot right in front of my eyes, which would have been, I'm
Yes.
sure, a very traumatic thing to deal with, you know. But you have to, once we get back to what I said about coping mechanisms, you have to find a way. Whatever your job was over there, you had to find a way to compartmentalize, you know. If something's really distasteful, really bad, really frightening or whatever, I've got to do a job. I still have to do a job. So I've got to, you know, I have a mission I have to follow. And just like the guys that are over there today, that's why they all need support.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a lot more to it than just, you know, what you see on the surface.
So when you were in the war, how did you stay in touch with your family? You talked about the care packages. Were there
Letters and cassette tapes, you know, making cassette tapes, sending them back and forth. There was a thing, you know, it's so, you'll all think, you know, this is like the Stone Age, you know, but they had this thing called the Mars phone. I don't know why they call it the Mars phone, other than, you know, it sounded celestial, you know, like the planet Mars. But it was a long-distance connection. And I think you got 2 phone calls during your tour, if I recall.
Okay.
I think I called a girlfriend I had, and I called my family on the 2 calls that I got. And it was kind of a scratchy, patchy call. You know, and there's a tremendous difference in time zones, so you had to work out what time is it in New York. You're halfway around the world on the other side, and it's literally another day there. But I remember the calls being somewhat, you know, interesting. But, you know, technology was really pretty primitive, you know, compared to, you know, the Droid 4G smartphone, which I'm sure you're all much more familiar with than I am.
So did that make it hard to stay in touch then, or?
It made it a little bit hard. It would be very hard for you,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in your generation. You would be going bonkers, you know. But at the time, it was probably the state of the art.
Mm-hmm.
It was the best they had, best you could get. And so, no, I got a lot. We did a lot of letter writing, and you know, so that kept me in touch. I actually wasn't that interested in talking to people, you know, live back to the States, because it was too painful to, you know. You felt like you were in jail and they were out of jail, you know, that kind of thing, you know. You just didn't feel, I didn't feel that at the end of a call like that, if I was doing that all the time, at the end of that call, I'm going to feel better. I perhaps could have felt worse, you know, that I have to end the call.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of ignored a lot of that stuff. And, you know, Bob Hope, I don't know if you ever heard of Bob Hope. He was a comedian who used to entertain the troops. He came there at Christmas time when I was in Vietnam, and, you know, tickets were given out. I gave my ticket away. I had no interest in, you know, I think it was wonderful that he did that for the troops, and, you know, he brought all kinds of people there, you know, current at the time movie stars and, you know, singers and so forth, and put on a show for the guys. And I thought that was great, but that wasn't for me. You know, it wasn't going to make me feel better. It was going to make me feel worse. You know, I didn't like being reminded of all of that. You know, I'd just rather not deal with it.
So would you say you experienced homesickness then? Or
I didn't really, because I basically blocked it out. I just,
Okay.
I got into the here and now. I said, this is where I am. I'm here and I'm now. I'm talking to you. I'm talking to you. I'm talking to you. Not thinking about what's going on back there too much. I'm not going to, like, get into a pity party about where I am. I'm not going to get really maudlin and emotional about it. I'm just going to focus on where I am right now and, try to appreciate whatever I can in the moment. And that worked for me. Everybody has their own way of coping, as I said, but that worked for me.
so then what did you do for fun while you were in the service?
Oh, it's a good question. They had some basketball courts on this one particular base, and I remember shooting baskets around, but not very often. Didn't do that very often. Listened to a lot of rock music. Tapes would be sent to me, from friends and from my family, or I'd say, I need the latest, Beatle album, Stones album, as I said before, I remember Led Zeppelin had come out with their first album at that time, and, that was kind of interesting to listen to. I wasn't a big fan of theirs, but I was a sponge for music, and I wanted to, so I spent a lot of time listening to tunes and reading.
Yeah. So, what were you hoping to get out of your wartime experience?
I was hoping to get out. That's what I was hoping for. As far as getting out, anything out of it, not a thing that I can remember. I just remember saying, this is one more day in, one day closer to getting out. I just want to get back home and resume my life, and just put this behind me and not be concerned with it anymore. While I'm here, I'll do the best I can, but, the sooner it ends, the better. Positively, hopefully.
Yeah. And so you said you went in sort of honoring the friends that you had in your neighborhood. Yeah,
I just felt, how could I live with myself if I didn't go? If I found some kind of weasel way to get out of it, or even if I had a legitimate way, if I said, I'm a conscientious objector and I'm going to go to jail for my principles. Well, I respect people that did that. Yeah. And I don't have any problem with that, if that's they felt strongly about it, but there are a lot of other weasel ways to get out of it, which I'm not that respectful of. In any case, all of those ways, under the circumstances, being brought up in an Irish Catholic neighborhood, 3 of your friends killed, knowing their parents, seeing the grief, how am I going to face them, with what they've gone through? And I say, they know that I've gotten out of it somehow. Just, life isn't fair, kind of thing, and I was just, in my own primitive way, trying to even it out and say, I got to do my part. It was that simple, really, and that complex at the same time. Yeah.
So, looking back, would you say it was worth it? You're glad you went, or would you have maybe gone to jail for it now?
I didn't know enough about it to go to jail. I mean, that would not. You got to. To me, the people that did that and really knew what was going on, I have to have respect for. But there were a lot of knuckleheads who didn't know what was going on. It's hard to have respect for them.
Yeah.
So, if I had to do over again, it would just depend on the circumstances. I can tell you this: I wouldn't be in Iraq, and I would not be in Afghanistan. I honor and appreciate the people that are doing that, but it wouldn't have been my cup of tea.
Yeah.
I really wasn't a military type person, so I'd like to think that I have bigger reasons for not being in or making a decision to not be in, but at the end of the day, it was really about survival. And I just said, hey, if I can go to Woodstock, or I can go to Vietnam, I go to Woodstock and party with everybody and all kinds of girls, or I can go be with a bunch of guys in Vietnam and get shot at. Well, what's your choice? I mean, it's a no-brainer, as far as I'm concerned. Simple as that.
Yeah. So, while you were in the service, how did you feel you changed? Did you keep any of your old hobbies or habits from pre-war life?
I kept the basics philosophically. I guess the same basic way of seeing the world and things like that. I had respect for people, and I think I have more of an open mind. Particularly right now, when you look at the polarized nature of politics in this country, I'm kind of a centrist. Mm-hmm. My wife is a little bit more left-leaning than I am, and then I have friends that are more right-leaning than I am, and they're sometimes they make pretty good arguments for what they say, but I can shoot holes in them. Mm-hmm. I wish that we could pull people more towards the middle. Yeah. And more towards an area of accommodation. And for me, that hasn't really changed very much. That's the way I've always seen things. I don't like to get out on the fringe, I guess.
Do you have any other stories from the service you'd like to share?
Do I have any other stories? I actually have I write short stories just for a hobby. Okay. And I am going to write a short story pretty soon. I'm not going to go into great detail about it because I'm going to write a short story. But there were some Vietnamese people that I dealt with who were extremely interesting. And one man in particular who was kind of a role model in his community. I think that what happens in war is you end up depersonalizing or dehumanizing the enemy, mm-hmm. quote unquote. That, if I really think that person isn't really fully a human being, it's a lot easier for me to throw them in jail, shoot them, bomb their village, take a flamethrower to their hooch or whatever, And I think that's a big problem with war. There's a lot of problems with war, but that's an essential human problem of just human respect for each other that's not there. Mm-hmm. And this particular man, I had a certain amount of respect for him for the way he handled himself in the situation he was in. I have a story that I want to write about him. So.
All right. Sounds interesting.
Yeah.
So then, when did your service end?
Well, anytime you're in the service, I'm sure it's the same now. I haven't really been speaking to too many people on active duty, but it's a 6-year commitment. Whether you're in the National Guard or whether you're a full-time 4-year, active duty person, mm-hmm. you basically serve a period of active duty, a period of active reserve, and a period of inactive reserve. In my case, it was 2 years active duty, 2 years active reserve, okay. 2 years inactive reserve. So a 6-year commitment is usually what happens.
And how did you feel when the war ended?
Well, I was happy to see it end. I think any time a war ends, let's party. That's as simple as that. Anybody who likes war and is depressed because it ends, as far as I'm concerned, is somewhat of a sociopath. You'd have to be. It probably didn't end as well as it could have or should have for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. But the fact that it ended is a good thing. Yeah. And I'd like to see the same thing happen with, Iraq is winding down, and that's good. I'd like to see that happen in Afghanistan. We have to be wary. We have to have a defense to counter certain threats. But anytime you can avoid war, that's okay in my book. The more you can talk and communicate rather than fight, mm-hmm. the better off you are. And that goes for fist fights in high school as well, just so you know. Talk and communicate. It's better than fighting.
Can you explain what your homecoming was like?
My homecoming was very weird. Compared to what happens today, and I'm very happy to see people acknowledging GIs in the airport when they're coming in or into their community, going up and thanking them. All of that makes me feel very good. Mm-hmm. And I kind of feel when they're thanking them, they're thanking me, for the thanks I never got. Because when I came back, I came back to Long Beach, California. That's where I got separated from active service into active reserve, as I said before. And I remember going to the gates in the military and on a naval base are manned by Marines, because the Marines are part of the Navy. They don't like to admit that, but they're part of the Navy. And so the Marines manned the gates, and you had to show your ID to get on and off the base. When you're in the military, and I'm sure it's still the same, you have a green ID card. When you go into separation status, or active reserve status, you get a red card. So that very morning that I was separated, I got my red card from the yeoman in the base office, and had the date, that day on it as effective this date, active reserve, which means I'm no longer on active duty. But I still had my green card. So when I got up to but it was expired for that day. So when I got up to the gate, the Marine said, want to see my identification before you let me off the base. I handed him the green card, and I said, you can keep that one. It was a great feeling of satisfaction, and I was walking on air for about 30 seconds, because when I left the base, outside the base, and I was with several other people who were also separated at the same time, so we all left the base, at that point in time. Lining both sides of the base were anti-war protesters who really didn't know what they were doing, and they were taking it out on us, calling us baby killers, screaming at us, cursing, and it was kind of, this is the welcoming that I got. I don't call that very kind, and I remember thinking at that particular moment, I got to get out of here. I have to get this uniform off as fast as possible, get civilian clothes on, and put this in the rearview mirror in every way I can, because this is as depressing as it gets. And then when I got back home, I actually thought, there wasn't anything like the yellow ribbons, that whole yellow ribbon thing. Incidentally, that comes from a Tony Orlando and Dawn song. And the yellow ribbon, if you ever listen to the song, refers to a guy who's getting out of jail. But now it's become different, which is fine. As long as you can, in any way you can welcome people is okay by me. But I just thought that was kind of ironic, the way that came about, the yellow ribbon piece. There were no yellow ribbons. There was no welcome home sign. I basically got back to my neighborhood, which, fairly teeming with people in New York City neighborhood. And there were people there who I was good friends with who knew me, and they treated me like I had never left. Just, hey, what do you say? Hey, how's it going? And the only welcome I got was with my mother, literally. She basically, was so happy to see me, crying, hugging me, and so forth. But everybody else ignored me. They didn't necessarily yell at me and call me baby killer. But they didn't acknowledge even that I was there. And I remember thinking, this is very, very odd. I've been away, and nobody's really even acknowledging anything. It's just surreal, and it doesn't happen that way now, and it never should have happened that way when I got out. But that's the way it was. So, as far as the long and short of it is, this is the long answer to your question. Welcome, 0. Outside of my mother. And even my father, as being a hardcore Irish immigrant, the day after I came back, that morning he woke me up, and he said, "You got to get out of bed." And I said, "What?" I said, what are you talking?" He said, "Well, you got to get out and get a job. You got to go. You got to go out." And, my mother came in and started in on my father and said, "Leave him alone." My father thought that was the right thing to do. But I think I could have maybe had a day off at that point. Anyway, that's kind of a semi-humorous story, because she kind of made him come to his senses and said, he just got back from Vietnam. He's not going to work today or tomorrow or next week. Okay, so get out of his room and let him go back to sleep.
So then, once you did get a job, was it different to be back into society? You only spent 6 years in the service, but
Well, I really didn't spend 6 years. I didn't even
right.
spend 2 years of active duty. I got out before the 2 years was up because once I got out of Vietnam,
Right.
what's the point? I mean, I don't need any more training. So that was basically it at that point. It was a big lead up of training to go there, went there, got back, and that was, basically my military career was just about over at that point, and then I started to focus back on education again, and I had the GI Bill, which I used to get a bachelor's and master's degree. And I ended up being very fortunate because I loved music and I loved rock and roll shows, and I was in New York City, which is one of the entertainment capitals of the world, if not the foremost one. And I managed to meet some people who got me into the rock and roll business at the time, and I ended up working, at these shows that I would have been at anyway, paying for as a fan, but I was getting paid to be there. Not that I was making a fortune, and not that I was going to make a career out of it, but at the time I said, wow, a year ago I was in Vietnam. Now I feel like I've died and went to heaven. I'm here watching the Allman Brothers, if you've heard of them, or the Stones, or Bob Dylan, and varieties of other icons of music who still appeal to people. In fact, they still appeal to people of your generation. Yeah. So it was quite amazing. And so I was able to supplement my education. I had a day job, which was going to school, and I had a night job, which was working rock and roll shows. So I'm very lucky in that respect. And that really eased the transition big time, for me.
Did you keep in touch with anybody that you were in the service with after war?
Well, the interesting thing is that when I got back, as I said, I got out in Long Beach, California, and I immediately rented a car. And I remember I think it was an Oldsmobile 88, and I hadn't driven a Jeep more than once or twice in Vietnam, and the roads are so terrible over there that you can't go. If your top end speed would be 30 miles an hour, really. And I didn't drive that much to begin with. And then I rented this vehicle, and now I got to get on the highway, the LA freeway or whatever it is, and I couldn't. I was frozen, trying to get on the freeway. But I went to see friends once I just said, okay, I got to get on the highway and get into it. And after about 15 minutes, I was able to calm down and drive the vehicle. And I went up to San Francisco to see buddies that I was in the service with. But we really haven't stayed that much in touch. Just kind of I wanted to go up and see them at the time, and we shared some, a day or two together. And then I headed back to New York, and that was that.
So then have you ever gone to any of the VFW meetings or the?
We have a group in town here. It's called Viva. I don't know if anybody else has said that to the groups, but they probably. My friend yesterday would have, I'm sure, if the question was brought up. It's basically Vietnam Era Veterans Association. So it's not just Vietnam veterans. Like I'm what you would call a Vietnam veteran because I was in country, as they say. But there were people who were in the service during the Vietnam War, but they may have been in the Mediterranean, they may have been in South America, they may have been in Japan, or someplace else. So they're called Vietnam era veterans because they were in the service during the same period of time. And that happens today too. Everybody in the service isn't in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so, basically, I'm trying to think of how I can put it. Our group, rather than join the VFW, we have our own little group, which is kind of a separate thing. Nothing wrong with the VFW. The VFW is fine. It's just not. It's a little too formal. There's a lot of Vietnam veterans who like the VFW and go there, but there's a whole another group of Vietnam veterans who have a different way of operating. And I'm also not really interested in going in the VFW. I don't know that this goes on, but in some VFWs it does go on where you're telling war stories with each other. I'm not that interested in telling war stories, and drinking, cheap beer. So, not that I don't want to put down the VFW. VFW is a very good organization. They do good things in the community, and we have friends who they just see things differently.
Yeah.
They have a different outlook on how you experience the war.
So what are some of the effects that the war had on you, mentally or physically?
Well, I'll tell you one that's interesting. Post-traumatic stress disorder is something now that's really become quite well known. But back then it wasn't. It actually was called post-traumatic stress syndrome back then. It wasn't even called disorder. It was called syndrome. And, now everybody seems to get it. It's kind of like, I had a bad time in City Market. Somebody, was yelling at me, so now I have post-traumatic stress, Well, maybe you do, But there was a point where it only had to do with war situations. Now it's a little bit more than that. And that's good. That's good, But back then, that kind of thing was confined to the war. And so what happened is, my view is that everybody who's in Vietnam, to a greater or lesser degree, has post-traumatic stress disorder. How could you not if you're a human being? Yeah. Subject to circumstances, let's just say they weren't normal. It's not normal to be under that kind of siege, under that kind of stress all the time, watching your backs, having to deal with death and people getting wounded and varieties of things like that. So I had a dream, it was a nightmare really, when I got back when it first started, shortly after I got back, I was having it maybe 3 times a week. Wow. And then it went, over the years, went down to maybe 2 times a week, and then once a week, and then once a month, and then once every 6 months. Very rarely do I have that dream anymore, but the nightmare was basically that I'm in my house, and I get a phone call from the government, and they say, you're going back, we're sending you back to Vietnam, we need you to go back. And I say over the phone, you're not getting me to go back, I'm not going back. And they say, well, we're coming over to get you. And I said, well, just try to get me, And while these guys are now apparently coming over to get me in my nightmare, I sandbag the entire house, every single window. I get out twin .50 caliber machine guns, and I'm prepared to kill them. And even though they are my countrymen, we are all in the United States. We're all American citizens, but these guys, as far as I'm concerned, are coming back to kill me. So they're putting me in a position where I have to kill them. And then I wake up in a cold sweat. That was a nightmare. And that happened, as I said, for quite a while, and then it eventually faded away. I did a little bit of private counseling on it. At the time, I didn't even think of using the VA. I could have probably used the VA on it, but I didn't. It wasn't even on my radar screen to think about going to the VA. Like I said, when the war was over, I just tried to forget about it, everything about it. Military, my ribbons that I had or anything like that, I couldn't tell you what happened to them. They just disappeared because it was just, I'm putting everything behind me. I never want to look back there again. And so, interestingly enough, if you recall Operation Desert Storm, when Bush the Elder sent troops into Iraq, the first Gulf War, they call it now. The troops went from Kuwait into Iraq. And that night that they went in, I had the dream. So that's how sensitive it is, Yeah. I mean, it's still lodged in there in my subconscious pretty deep. It doesn't really bother me that much anymore. I don't really have it very often. I've come to terms with it, but you're talking about fallout. Well, that's stress disorder, really, fallout. But thank God otherwise I feel healthy and happy, and I've had a very good career. I got a lovely wife. I have a granddaughter now. Life is good. So, and so I actually feel like I'm one of the lucky ones. There's different stages of luck, and I'm one of the luckier persons, to have survived the Vietnam War. And I wish the same luck to every everybody who's involved with these wars now, that they can get out and reconstruct or resurrect a good quality of life.
All right, thank you very much for your time, Brian.
Okay,
And thank you for your service, too.
thanks. Appreciate that.